On March 11, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur stood in the darkness outside Malinta Tunnel on the fortress island of Corregidor. Japanese artillery had been pounding the rock for months. The men defending the Philippines were starving. They were dying of malaria and dysentery in numbers that would have been unthinkable just weeks before, and MacArthur, the most famous American general in the Pacific, was about to leave them behind. Waiting for him at the North Dock was a battered PT boat that would carry him through 560 miles of Japanese-controlled waters to the southern island of Mindanao. From there, he would fly to Australia. But before he departed into the darkness, MacArthur had one final conversation with the man he was leaving in command. Major General Jonathan Wainwright stood before his commanding officer, knowing he had just inherited an impossible situation. Wainwright was a cavalryman, a soldier's soldier who had earned the nickname Skinny for his gaunt, angular frame. At 61 years old, he had spent his entire adult life in uniform. He knew what MacArthur was really asking him to do. According to accounts from those present at their final meeting, MacArthur looked at Wainwright and promised to return with reinforcements. He promised that help was coming from Australia. He presented Wainwright with a box of cigars and 2 jars of shaving cream, small luxuries that had become precious on the besieged island. Then MacArthur spoke the words that would haunt both men. "Goodbye, Jonathan. When I get back, if you are still on Bataan, I will make you a lieutenant general." Wainwright's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. "I will be on Bataan if I am still alive." Both men understood what neither would say aloud. There would be no reinforcements. The men on Bataan and Corregidor had been written off by Washington months ago. The war strategy called Europe first, and the Pacific would have to wait its turn for men and material that were desperately needed to stop Hitler. Wainwright was not being asked to hold out until help arrived. He was being asked to fight until he could fight no more. MacArthur was leaving him to preside over what would become the largest American military surrender since the Civil War. The story of what happened next reveals something profound about duty, sacrifice, and the terrible arithmetic of war. It is a story of a general who spent 3 years believing he would be remembered as a coward, only to become one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. It is a story of men who called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan and died by the thousands in a death march that shocked the world. And it begins with understanding why MacArthur left in the first place. To understand the weight of this departure, you have to understand what the Philippines meant to Douglas MacArthur. His connection to the islands stretched back decades. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had served as military governor of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Douglas himself had first arrived in the islands in 1903 as a young second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point. He had returned again and again throughout his career. In 1935, MacArthur had retired from the United States Army to become the military advisor to the Commonwealth of the Philippines. He was helping the newly autonomous nation build its own defense forces. When war with Japan became inevitable, Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active duty as commander of United States Army forces in the Far East. The Philippines was not just another posting for MacArthur. It was the place where he had spent the formative years of his career. Leaving felt like abandoning his second home. The decision to evacuate MacArthur did not come from MacArthur himself. On February 22, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall jointly ordered MacArthur to abandon the Philippines. The telegram was direct and left no room for interpretation. The President directs that you make arrangements to leave and proceed to Mindanao. You are directed to make this change as quickly as possible. From Mindanao, you will proceed to Australia, where you will assume command of all United States troops. MacArthur's initial reaction was defiance. He seriously considered resigning his commission and fighting on as a volunteer alongside his men. It would have been a dramatic gesture worthy of his sense of theatre. His staff, horrified by the implications, talked him out of it. Just 11 days earlier, MacArthur had sent a message to Roosevelt declaring that he and his family intended to share the fate of the garrison. He had meant every word, but the strategic calculus was brutal and left little room for sentiment. Singapore had fallen on February 15th. The British had surrendered more than 80,000 troops to the Japanese in what Winston Churchill later called the worst disaster in British military history. The Allies were reeling across the entire Pacific theatre. They needed experienced commanders who understood the Japanese enemy, and MacArthur was too valuable to lose. Even worse from Washington's perspective was the possibility of capture. The propaganda value of parading Douglas MacArthur before Japanese cameras would have been incalculable. Roosevelt and Marshall simply could not allow it. The president explained the decision to the American public in careful terms. He acknowledged that every man and woman in the United States admired General MacArthur's determination to fight to the finish with his men in the Philippines, but he added that all important decisions must be made with a view toward the successful termination of the war. The nation's interests outweighed any single garrison, no matter how heroic. The words sounded reasonable. They concealed an awful truth that the men on Bataan had already figured out for themselves. They had been abandoned. The Europe First policy agreed upon by Roosevelt and Churchill meant that the bulk of American resources went to the Atlantic theatre. The Japanese naval blockade around the Philippines made meaningful reinforcement essentially impossible. Of 6 supply ships sent from Australia, only 3 even reached the Philippines. The rest were hunted down and sunk. MacArthur knew all of this. He had been begging Washington for reinforcements for months, watching his messages disappear into silence, and on the night of March 11, at approximately 8:00 in the evening, he gathered his family and key staff officers and boarded PT-41 for the most dangerous journey of his life. The escape itself was a harrowing 35-hour voyage through enemy-controlled waters. 4 battered PT boats formed the small flotilla. PT-41 carried MacArthur, his wife Jean, their 4-year-old son Arthur, the boy's Chinese nurse, Ah Chu, and several senior staff officers. PT-32, PT-34, and PT-35 carried additional personnel. Lieutenant John Bulkley, a young naval officer who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his exploits, commanded the mission. The boats were in terrible condition. The Japanese blockade meant that spare parts were impossible to obtain. Engines that should have been overhauled months ago were held together by improvisation and prayer. The crews had been subsisting on the same starvation rations as everyone else on Corregidor. Bulkley himself had lost nearly 30 pounds during the siege. They departed at dusk, slipping through the minefields that protected Manila Bay. The night was dark, which provided cover but also made navigation treacherous. The boats navigated by dead reckoning through uncharted passages between islands that might or might not be occupied by Japanese forces. Seas ran 15 to 20 feet high, tossing the small wooden boats like corks. MacArthur's wife and son were violently seasick. So was most of the party. MacArthur himself sat rigid and silent through most of the journey, lost in his thoughts about the men he was leaving behind. At one point during the night, the boats scattered to avoid what appeared to be a Japanese cruiser. PT-41 became separated from the others. Bulkley pushed on alone through the darkness, unsure whether the rest of the flotilla had survived. When dawn broke on March 12th, Bulkley spotted the other 3 boats. They had all made it through the night. But the journey was far from over. They still had to cross the Mindanao Sea in daylight, exposed to Japanese aircraft that patrolled the waters constantly. The PT boats arrived at Cagayan Point on the northern coast of Mindanao on March 13th. MacArthur stepped off the boat and turned to Bulkley with words of gratitude. "I am giving every officer and man here the Silver Star for gallantry," he said. "You have taken me out of the jaws of death, and I will not forget it." MacArthur had escaped Corregidor, but he could not escape the weight of what he had done. He waited 3 days at Del Monte Airfield for better aircraft. The B-17 bombers that were supposed to carry him to Australia had been damaged and needed repairs. Finally, on March 17th, two B-17s took off for the 1,500-mile flight to Darwin, passing between two major Japanese air bases. If Japanese fighters had intercepted them, the war in the Pacific might have taken a very different course. His staff later described this period as probably the darkest moment of his life, both literally and figuratively. During the voyage from Corregidor, MacArthur had poured out his torment to his aides. He could not shake the feeling that he had abandoned his post in wartime, that he had left his men to die while he sailed to safety. 6 days after leaving Corregidor, MacArthur arrived at a small railway junction in South Australia called Terawee. It was a break-of-gauge station, a place where passengers changed trains because different rail lines used different track widths. MacArthur had intended to make his first public statement in Melbourne, but two journalists from the Adelaide Advertiser were waiting at the station. Speaking off the cuff to the surprised reporters, MacArthur delivered words that would become among the most famous of the entire war. The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary object of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through, and I shall return. I shall return, not we shall return, as Washington later suggested he should have said. I shall return. MacArthur refused to change the wording. Filipino journalist Carlos Romulo had argued that the Filipino people would trust MacArthur personally, not some abstract American promise. The phrase became a rallying cry scratched on walls throughout the occupied Philippines. For the men MacArthur left behind, those three words were a promise they could only pray he would keep. Back on Corregidor and Bataan, Wainwright faced a nightmare that grew worse by the day. The Japanese had attacked the Philippines just hours after Pearl Harbor. On December 8, 1941, Japanese bombers caught most of MacArthur's air force on the ground at Clark Field and destroyed it. Within days, Japanese troops were landing on the beaches of Luzon. MacArthur's forces, a mix of American regulars, Philippine scouts, and newly mobilized Filipino soldiers, could not hold back the invasion. MacArthur ordered a fighting retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, a mountainous jungle extending into Manila Bay. The plan, codenamed War Plan Orange 3, had been developed years earlier. It called for the defenders to hold Bataan until the United States Navy could fight its way across the Pacific with reinforcements. No one had anticipated that the Navy would be crippled at Pearl Harbor or that the relief would never come. The situation Wainwright inherited was catastrophic. Approximately 80,000 American and Filipino troops had been defending the Bataan Peninsula since early January. The retreat to Bataan had been a masterpiece of improvisation, but it came with a terrible cost. Supply depots that were supposed to sustain the army had been scattered across Luzon. There was no time to consolidate them before the Japanese advance cut off access. By the time MacArthur left, the garrison had been on half rations for 2 months. By early April, daily calorie intake had dropped from the standard 2,000 calories to barely 1,000. The men ate anything they could find. Army horses and mules were slaughtered for meat until none remained. Soldiers hunted monkeys in the jungle. They ate snakes, lizards, and insects. Carabao, the water buffalo that Filipino farmers used to plow their fields, became prized targets. When there were no more carabao, men stripped bark from trees and boiled it into a bitter soup. Disease was even more devastating than hunger. Malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire. Army records indicate that more than 70% of the troops contracted the disease during the campaign. The quinine supply, essential for treating malaria, ran out completely in mid-February. Men shook with fever while trying to hold their positions. Between bouts of chills, they suffered from dysentery that left them dehydrated and weak. The medical situation was overwhelming. Hospitals carved out of the jungle operated around the clock. Doctors performed surgery by flashlight, while Japanese bombers circled overhead. There were not enough beds, not enough bandages, not enough of anything. Wounded men lay on the ground waiting for treatment that might never come. The Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma had also suffered terribly in the initial fighting. The Filipino and American defenders had fought with a ferocity that stunned the Japanese high command. Tokyo had expected to conquer the Philippines in 50 days. Instead, the campaign dragged on for months. By February, Japanese Army Surgeon Horiguchi estimated that 10 to 12,000 Japanese soldiers were sick with malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. Effective combat strength had dropped to fewer than 3,000 men. But in March, fresh reinforcements arrived from Japan. 22,000 healthy troops landed to replace the sick and wounded. The balance of forces, which had briefly favored the defenders, shifted decisively back to the attackers. Wainwright was promoted to Lieutenant General on March 19th and designated Commander of United States Forces in the Philippines on March 22nd. This promotion came with a cruel, bureaucratic twist. MacArthur had deliberately fragmented command authority into 4 separate zones, intending to retain overall control from Australia. He wanted to command the defense of the Philippines long distance. Washington overruled him. The War Department placed Wainwright in charge of all forces in the archipelago. This decision, made for administrative convenience, would later force Wainwright to surrender the entire Philippines rather than just Corregidor. MacArthur's command arrangement might have allowed other commanders to continue fighting as guerrillas. The unified command Wainwright inherited meant that his surrender would be total. The final Japanese offensive began on April 3, 1942. It was Good Friday, the day before Easter. Japanese artillery opened with the heaviest barrage of the campaign. More than 150 guns pounded the American and Filipino lines. Fresh Japanese troops, well-fed and healthy, advanced against defenders who could barely stand. Within 6 days, the defensive lines collapsed. The men who had held out for 3 months simply could not fight anymore. Combat effectiveness, the Army's cold measurement of military capability, had disintegrated. A soldier was considered combat effective if he could walk 100 yards without staggering and still retain enough strength to fire his weapon. By early April, fewer than half the remaining troops on Bataan met even this minimal standard. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King Jr., the officer commanding forces on Bataan, made the decision that Wainwright had dreaded. King surrendered. He did so against explicit orders from both MacArthur and Wainwright. MacArthur had cabled that there should be no surrender under any conditions. Wainwright had passed on the order. King understood that he was ending his military career. He also understood that continued resistance would mean nothing but additional slaughter. His men could no longer fight. Further combat would only increase the body count without changing the outcome. In his final communication to his troops, King said something that would echo through history. "You men remember this. You did not surrender. You had no alternative but to obey my order." He took sole responsibility for the decision, hoping to shield his men from any taint of disgrace. The numbers were staggering. Approximately 76,000 troops surrendered on Bataan, including roughly 10 to 12,000 Americans and 64 to 66,000 Filipinos. What followed was one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War. The Bataan Death March began on April 10, 1942. Japanese commanders had planned for perhaps 40,000 prisoners. They received nearly twice that number. There were no preparations to feed them, transport them, or provide medical care. What followed was a 65-mile forced march through tropical heat that killed thousands. The prisoners marched from Mariveles and Bagak at the southern tip of Bataan to San Fernando in the north. From San Fernando, they were packed into railroad boxcars for a journey to Capas. From Capas, they marched another 7 to 9 miles to Camp O'Donnell. The entire journey took between 5 and 10 days, depending on when a prisoner started and how fast his group moved. Japanese guards showed no mercy to those who could not keep up. Men who stumbled were bayoneted where they fell. Men who asked for water were beaten or shot. Men who stopped to help fallen comrades were attacked. Trucks and tanks ran over prisoners who had collapsed in the road. Survivors later testified to horrors that shocked the American public when the news finally reached home. Lester Tenney of the 192nd Tank Battalion was among those who made the march. He later testified that most of the men were already sick before they started walking. They had dysentery. They had malaria. Many had untreated wounds from the fighting. A man would fall down, and the Japanese would holler at him to get up. Tenney watched Japanese soldiers bayonet men where they lay, killing them in seconds for the crime of being too weak to stand. Marine Private First Class Irvin Scott witnessed atrocities that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw tanks and trucks deliberately run over American soldiers. He saw men decapitated. He saw prisoners crucified with bayonets driven through their hands and rib cages. At the Bataan River, Japanese soldiers carried out a mass execution. Between 350 and 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers were lined up and killed. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer notorious for his brutality, had ordered that no prisoners be taken. The bodies were left where they fell. The exact casualty figures from the death march remain uncertain because of the chaotic conditions and the absence of Japanese records. Historical estimates suggest that approximately 500 to 650 Americans died during the march itself. Filipino deaths were far higher, with estimates ranging from 5,000 to more than 10,000. But the dying did not stop when the march ended. Camp O'Donnell, the destination for the survivors, was a death camp in everything but name. The facility had been designed to hold perhaps 9,000 troops. More than 50,000 prisoners were crammed inside its barbed wire fences. There was insufficient water. There was almost no food. There was no medicine. Disease swept through the camp unchecked. In the 71 days that Camp O'Donnell operated as a prisoner of war facility, more than 1,500 Americans died. Filipino deaths numbered over 20,000. Men died of dysentery, of malaria, of untreated wounds, of starvation, of despair. The total death toll from the Bataan surrender through the early months of captivity reached into the tens of thousands. The American public did not learn the full extent of these atrocities until much later. In April 1943, 10 American prisoners escaped from a camp in the southern Philippines. They made their way through the jungle, linked up with Filipino guerrillas, and eventually reached Australia by submarine. Their accounts of the death march were verified by military intelligence and released to the press in January 1944. The news hit the American home front like what one reporter called the biggest bombshell since Pearl Harbor. The carefully maintained image of a civilized enemy capable of honorable warfare was shattered. Recruitment offices reported a surge in enlistments from men who wanted to avenge Bataan. The phrase "Remember Bataan" became a rallying cry that lasted until the end of the war. For the survivors in the camps, the years that followed brought constant suffering. Prisoners were transferred from Camp O'Donnell to other facilities throughout the Philippines and eventually to camps in Japan, Korea, Manchuria, and Taiwan. They worked as slave laborers in mines and factories. They built roads and airfields for their captors. They died of disease, of malnutrition, of random brutality. Perhaps the cruelest fate awaited those prisoners who were loaded onto unmarked transport ships for transfer to Japan. The Japanese did not mark these vessels as carrying prisoners of war. American submarines, hunting for enemy shipping, torpedoed several of these hell ships without knowing they were killing their own countrymen. The Arasan Maru, sunk on October 24, 1944, took more than 1,700 American prisoners to their deaths. Only 9 survived. While the horror unfolded on the Bataan Peninsula, Wainwright remained on Corregidor with approximately 13,000 troops. The fortress island, which American soldiers called the Rock, was the last organized American position in the Philippines. Japanese artillery on Bataan, now in enemy hands, pounded Corregidor day and night. The bombardment was relentless. One officer noted that a single day of shelling inflicted more damage than all previous bombing raids combined. The massive coastal guns that were supposed to protect Manila Bay were systematically destroyed in their emplacements. By late April, all the batteries on the northern shore of Corregidor had been silenced. On May 2nd, Japanese artillery achieved a devastating concentration of fire. 3,600 rounds of 240mm shells crashed into batteries Cheney and Geary. When Geary's ammunition magazine exploded, 8 guns were destroyed simultaneously. The blast was felt miles away. The main armament that made Corregidor a fortress was gone. The Japanese landing came on the night of May 5th. 2,000 troops in the first wave paddled across the narrow strait separating Corregidor from Bataan. 4,000 more followed in the second wave. The defenders fought back with everything they had left. American gunners caught many of the landing craft in the open water. 2/3 of the boats were sunk before reaching shore. At least 900 Japanese soldiers were killed and 1,200 wounded in the initial assault. One Japanese officer later described the crossing as a dreadful massacre, but the Japanese kept coming. By morning, they had established a beachhead. More importantly, they had landed tanks. The light tanks rumbled inland, advancing toward Malinta Tunnel. Inside Malinta Tunnel lay the heart of the Corregidor garrison. More than 1,000 wounded soldiers had been carried into the underground corridors for shelter from the relentless bombardment. Approximately 150 army nurses tended to them, working around the clock in conditions that defied description. The tunnel was crowded with civilians, staff officers, communication personnel, and everyone else who could not man the defensive perimeter. The air was foul with the smell of wounds and sickness. The constant shelling caused the rock walls to shake, sending dust filtering down onto the patients. At 10 o'clock on the morning of May 6, 1942, Wainwright summoned his 2 senior commanders. He asked Generals Beebe and Moore a simple question. Could they hold out through the day? Both men agreed there should be no delay. Wainwright later wrote in his memoir about the moment he made his decision. It was the terror vested in a tank that was the deciding factor. He thought of the havoc that even one of those steel beasts could wreak if it nosed into the tunnel, where lay the helpless wounded and their brave nurses. He could order his men to fight to the last. They would obey, and thousands of helpless people would be massacred in the process. Or he could surrender. At 10:30 that morning, General Lewis Beebe broadcast Wainwright's surrender offer over the Voice of Freedom radio station. When Japanese Commander General Homer received the message, he demanded more. He refused to accept the surrender of just Corregidor. He wanted all American and Filipino forces throughout the Philippines to lay down their arms. If Wainwright refused, Homer threatened to treat the nearly 11,000 prisoners already in Japanese hands on Corregidor as hostages. Wainwright had no leverage. Facing this ultimatum, he surrendered unconditionally at midnight on May 6th. Before meeting Homer to formalize the capitulation, Wainwright sent a final message to President Roosevelt. The words have been preserved as one of the most eloquent expressions of military honor under impossible circumstances. With broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame, I report to Your Excellency that today I must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay. If you agree, please say to the nation that my troops and I accomplished all that is humanly possible and that we have upheld the best traditions of the United States Army. There is a limit of human endurance, and that limit has long since been passed. May God bless and preserve you and guide you and the nation in the ultimate victory. With profound regret and continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander. Goodbye, Mr. President. For Wainwright, the surrender was only the beginning of his suffering. He spent the next 39 months as a prisoner of war. The Japanese moved him repeatedly, always farther from potential rescue. First, he was held in the Philippines. In August 1942, he was transferred to Taiwan. He spent time at camps called Hato, Karenko, and Moksak. The conditions were brutal. In December 1944, with American forces advancing through the Pacific, the Japanese moved Wainwright and 33 other senior Allied officers to Manchuria in northeastern China. The camp near Xi'an was approximately 100 miles north of Mukden, deep in territory the Japanese had controlled since 1931. Manchurian winters were savage. Temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. The prisoners had inadequate clothing and heating. Food was scarce and of poor quality. Already thin when captured, Wainwright became skeletal. His hair turned white. His skin cracked and developed sores. His hearing deteriorated. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Throughout his captivity, Wainwright agonized over his decision to surrender Corregidor. He kept a diary in which he replayed those final hours again and again. He wondered if he could have held out longer. He wondered if some combination of courage and sacrifice might have changed the outcome. He was convinced that America blamed him for the fall of the Philippines. He expected that if he survived the war, he would face court-martial and disgrace. He would be remembered as the general who surrendered, not as the man who held Corregidor for a month after Bataan fell, not as the soldier who protected 1,000 wounded men and their nurses from Japanese tanks, just as the man who raised the white flag. He had no way of knowing that back in the United States, the conversation about his legacy had taken a very different turn. In the summer of 1942, General George Marshall had proposed awarding Wainwright the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. MacArthur was furious when he learned of the recommendation. From his headquarters in Australia, MacArthur sent cables opposing the nomination. He called it a grave mistake, which later on might well lead to embarrassing repercussions. He argued that Wainwright had become temporarily unbalanced during the final days on Corregidor. Most damningly, MacArthur wrote that honoring Wainwright would be an injustice to unnamed generals who had exhibited powers of leadership and inspiration to a degree greatly superior. Secretary of War Henry Stimson reviewed MacArthur's objections carefully. He rejected them as untenable and on their face untrue. But to avoid an open conflict with MacArthur during the war, Marshall shelved the nomination. Wainwright would have to wait. Meanwhile, MacArthur worked to fulfill the promise he had made at Taree Railway Station. From Australia, he commanded the Southwest Pacific Theatre in a campaign that slowly but relentlessly pushed the Japanese back toward their home islands. The strategy was called island hopping. Rather than attack every Japanese-held island, MacArthur's forces seized key positions and bypassed others, leaving Japanese garrisons to wither without supplies or reinforcement. The campaign advanced through New Guinea, through the Solomon Islands, through the approaches to the Philippines. By the fall of 1944, American forces were within striking distance of the islands MacArthur had been forced to abandon 2.5 years earlier. On October 20th, 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his promise. He waded ashore at Red Beach on the island of Leyte while the battle for the beachhead was still ongoing. His staff had urged him to wait until the area was secure. Japanese shells were still falling within earshot. Snipers might be anywhere. MacArthur refused to wait. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it in the most dramatic fashion possible. A landing craft brought him as close to shore as it could manage, but the water was still too shallow for the ramp to reach dry land. MacArthur stepped off into knee-deep surf and waded the remaining distance, his famous corncob pipe clenched between his teeth. The photographers captured the moment, and the image became one of the most famous photographs of the Pacific War. Standing soaking wet on the beach, MacArthur reached a radio microphone that had been set up for his use. The words he spoke were broadcast across the Philippines and around the world. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Of the approximately 90,000 troops MacArthur had left behind in March 1942, only about 1/3 survived to see his return. The rest had perished in battle, on the death march, in prisoner of war camps, or aboard the unmarked transport ships that never reached their destinations. The war ended in August 1945, after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 19th, an Office of Strategic Services team parachuted into Manchuria to locate and liberate Allied prisoners of war. The mission was codenamed Operation Cardinal. Major Robert Lamar led the small team into territory that had been enemy-controlled for 14 years. Lamar found Wainwright at the camp near Sian. The general Lamar encountered was barely recognizable as the man who had commanded the defense of Corregidor. Wainwright was emaciated, his body ravaged by 3 years of malnutrition and disease. When Lamar told him he was no longer a prisoner, that he was going home, Wainwright's response revealed how deeply captivity had wounded him. "Are you really Americans?" he asked. MacArthur and Wainwright reunited on August 31st, 1945, at the new Grand Hotel in Yokohama, Japan. According to witnesses, MacArthur was having dinner when word reached him that Wainwright had arrived. He hurried from the dining room, threw his arms around his former subordinate, and neither man spoke for several moments. MacArthur was reportedly stunned by Wainwright's physical condition. 2 days later came the ceremony that would close the book on World War II in the Pacific. On September 2nd, 1945, representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the instrument of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. More than 250 American warships rode at anchor in the bay. 450 carrier aircraft flew overhead in formation. MacArthur presided over the ceremony. He could have positioned himself in the center of attention, alone in the moment of triumph. Instead, he made a deliberate choice about who would stand beside him. Directly behind MacArthur, in places of honor, stood 2 officers. On one side was Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, the man who had surrendered the Philippines. On the other was Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British commander who had surrendered Singapore. These were the generals who had experienced the lowest moments of the Allied war effort. MacArthur wanted them present for the highest. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. At 9:02 in the morning, the Japanese delegation boarded the Missouri and stood facing the Allied commanders. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed first, his movements awkward because of an artificial leg he had worn since losing his limb to an assassin's bomb years earlier. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, signed next, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Then MacArthur sat at the green baize-covered table and picked up the first of several pens. He used multiple pens deliberately, intending to distribute them as mementos. After affixing his signature, he paused and handed the first pen to Wainwright. The second went to Percival. Additional pens went to West Point, to the Naval Academy, and to MacArthur's personal archives. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The instruments of Japan's defeat now belonged to the men Japan had once conquered. 8 days later, on September 10th, 1945, President Harry Truman summoned Wainwright to the White House. Wainwright assumed it was a routine courtesy call. In the Rose Garden, with no advance warning, Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor. The citation praised Wainwright for his intrepid and determined leadership against greatly superior enemy forces. It specifically noted that the final stand on beleaguered Corregidor, for which he was in an important measure personally responsible, commanded the admiration of the nation and its allies. Wainwright was stunned. He had expected nothing. He had prepared himself for court-martial, for disgrace, for the bitter judgment of a nation that remembered only that he had surrendered. Instead, he stood in the Rose Garden of the White House while the President of the United States pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest. Observers reported that tears rolled down his sunken cheeks as Truman read the citation. The general who had spent 3 years convinced he was a disgrace to his uniform was being honored with his nation's highest military decoration. Everything he had believed about how America viewed him was wrong. When Truman noticed his distress and told him to take it easy, Wainwright managed a response that captured everything he had endured. "That is all right, Mr. President. I am pretty tough, or I would not be here." The story of MacArthur and Wainwright did not end with medals and ceremonies. Both men remained controversial figures whose decisions continued to be debated by historians. MacArthur's critics pointed out that he had visited his troops on Bataan only once during the entire 4-month campaign. On January 10, 1942, he made a single trip to the front lines. Then he returned to Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor and never went back. While his men starved and fought and died, MacArthur remained underground on the rock. The troops noticed. They composed a bitter song to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic that spread through the foxholes of Bataan. Dugout Doug MacArthur lies a-shaking on the rock, safe from all the bombers and from any sudden shock. Dugout Doug is eating of the best food on Bataan, and his troops go starving on. The nickname Dugout Doug followed MacArthur for the rest of his career. His defenders argued that he faced an impossible situation created by Washington's decision to prioritize Europe. The order to leave came from the President of the United States. His strategic value in Australia proved crucial to winning the Pacific War. Notably, MacArthur himself had received the Medal of Honor in June 1942, just months after his escape. The citation stated that the award was given partly to offset any propaganda by the enemy directed at his leaving his command. The same honor that would later vindicate Wainwright had first been used to shield MacArthur from criticism. When MacArthur returned to the Philippines in 1944, he frequently visited frontline positions, exposing himself to enemy fire with what some called reckless disregard for his own safety. No one dared call him Dugout Doug to his face after Leyte. Wainwright faced different questions. Some historians have wondered whether he surrendered Corregidor too quickly. MacArthur had explicitly ordered that there be no surrender under any conditions. Should Wainwright have fought to the last man? Secretary of War Stimson addressed this criticism directly. Wainwright faced Japanese tanks advancing on a tunnel filled with more than 1,000 wounded soldiers and 150 nurses. Further resistance would not have been heroism. It would have been massacre. Wainwright made the only decision a decent man could make under those circumstances. General Homer, the Japanese commander who had accepted both surrenders, faced his own day of judgment. In January 1946, he was brought before a military tribunal in Manila, charged with war crimes related to the Bataan Death March. The trial lasted 5 weeks. Homer's defense argued that he had not personally ordered the atrocities and had not known the full extent of what happened during the march. The tribunal rejected his arguments. Command responsibility held generals accountable for the actions of their subordinates. On April 3, 1946, exactly 4 years and 6 days after the Bataan Death March began, Masaharu Homer was executed by firing squad at a location near Manila. MacArthur, who approved the sentence, granted one concession to Homer's dignity. The general faced a firing squad rather than the hangman's noose, a form of execution considered more honorable under Japanese military tradition. Wainwright returned to the United States as a national hero, though he never fully believed he deserved the adulation. He commanded the Fourth Army until his retirement in 1947. He remained active in Veterans Affairs and was prepared to deliver the nominating speech for MacArthur at the 1948 Republican National Convention. MacArthur did not secure the nomination. Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright IV died on September 2, 1953. The date was exactly 8 years to the day after he had stood behind MacArthur on the deck of the Missouri and watched Japan surrender. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Section 1, Grave 358. General Omar Bradley and General George Marshall attended his funeral. Douglas MacArthur was notably absent. Today, Wainwright's name is preserved at Fort Wainwright in Alaska and at a Veterans Administration Medical Center in Washington State. A monument stands on Corregidor itself, on the island where he made his impossible choice. His Medal of Honor citation is inscribed in stone there, where thousands of visitors read it each year. The man who expected nothing but disgrace is remembered as one of the most courageous officers in American military history. The story of MacArthur and Wainwright matters because it illuminates the terrible choices that war forces upon those who fight. MacArthur was ordered to abandon men he had sworn to lead. He obeyed, and the weight of that decision never left him. Wainwright was ordered to hold a position that could not be held. He held it until Japanese tanks were rolling toward a tunnel full of helpless wounded, then he surrendered to save their lives. Both men carried scars that never fully healed. MacArthur rarely spoke about his departure from Corregidor in later years. When he did, his words revealed a wound that time could not close. Wainwright never stopped questioning whether he had made the right decision, even after his Medal of Honor vindicated his choice in the eyes of the nation. The troops on Bataan gave themselves a name that captured their abandonment. They called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunt, no uncle, no nephew, no niece, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. They fought knowing that no help would come. They surrendered knowing that worse awaited them. They died by the thousands in a march that was designed to kill them. And through all of it, they held to the 3 words their commander had spoken before disappearing into the darkness of the Philippine night. I shall return. MacArthur kept that promise. He returned to the Philippines on October 20th, 1944. He liberated the prison camps. He watched Japan surrender on the deck of the Missouri. But for thousands of the men he left behind, the return came too late. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Each video helps preserve stories that deserve to be remembered. These men faced impossible situations with a courage that still inspires us today. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Was MacArthur right to leave? Did Wainwright make the only possible choice when he surrendered? History rarely offers easy answers, but it always gives us questions worth asking. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.